Do not be afraid as I, Jesus said. You know, this summer, those of you who are movie lovers, you haven't had a chance to see the summer blockbusters. One of the things that has become more and more real, more and more expected in movies is they are to become more spectacular. They're to be bigger chase scenes, bigger explosions, more fantastic images. I mean, and quite honestly, there's some really incredible images. There's images, there's a movie that I kind of enjoyed called Inception, and they can turn the world upside down and do all kinds of things. But this desire for the spectacular, movies have to continue to outdo the last one. They've got to get better and bigger, more and more of it. And we want to be more and more thrilled by what we see on the big screen. And we want to experience it more and more. We crave more and more excitement. And unfortunately, sometimes that's what happens with scriptures. We begin to become fascinated with more and extravagant and exciting. There are reasons why so many people seem to focus on these incredible images from the book of Revelation or from the prophetic writings. And we want and take that attitude that we take to the movies and we bring it to Scripture, and we look for those spectacular events in the Bible. The parting of the Red Sea, the plagues on Egypt. And we often do that with Jesus, and we look at the miracles and are astonished by what He does. But it was never Jesus' purpose, and never God's purpose, to do something spectacular to get our attention so that we will know who He is. As a matter of fact, Jesus Himself rejected that model. When Satan came to Him and said, "Throw yourself down off of the temple," Jesus said, "Don't put the Lord your God to the test." When Jesus was hanging on the cross, they said, "Come down off the cross and we will believe you." But Jesus didn't do that. And the reason He didn't do that is because it's not about the spectacular thing. Because in the end, the spectacular does not hold our attention long. It doesn't cause our faith to deepen. Look at the children of Israel. I've shared this before. God did all the plagues, and yet the people doubted at the Red Sea. God split the Red Sea and they doubted in the desert. When He got to the promised land, they doubted at the promised land. God did great things. He brought water out of a rock. He fed them every day. And yet when it came to the next thing, they still didn't believe. Because the spectacular didn't give them the grounding and the faith to become the people that God desired them to be. So as we come to this story that I just read to you of Jesus walking on the water, I think we have to ask ourselves, why did Jesus do this? Why did Jesus choose to walk on the water and do this rather spectacular miracle? You know, we can understand some of the things that He did. We can understand why He would eradicate leprosy from a man. We can understand why Jesus would take the blindness away from a man. We can understand as He cast out the demons and they go scattering, why He did those things. It was for the benefit of other people. It brought healing. But what particular purpose was there for Him walking on the water? To me, this is one of the more strange miracles for that very reason. We don't have a clear-cut purpose for the miracle. And like I said, I do not believe that it was just about saying, "Look at me, look what I can do." Jesus never did miracles for that reason. Matter of fact, He often encouraged other people not to talk about His miracles, because that was not the way to convince people to believe. So in this strange miracle, what is going on? What is Jesus doing? To do this, we need to go back and look at the story first. If you remember, the walking on the water occurs right after Jesus feeds 5,000 men and their families with bread, with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. They saw this incredible miracle. The disciples, that is. They saw what Jesus did. Certainly they were moved by it, impressed. But more than just the feeding, the fact that it would have reminded them, first of all, they were in the wilderness. Kind of like the people of Israel were in the wilderness. And then miraculously comes bread to feed all the people. A good Jewish person, a person immersed as the Jews of that day would have been in the Scriptures, could not have missed, and when I say the Scriptures, I mean the Old Testament Scriptures, could not have missed the reality that Jesus was modeling for them the power of God that had happened in the wilderness. God fed them in the wilderness. Now Jesus feeds them in the wilderness. There's a clear connection between God in Exodus and Jesus in Matthew that you have to not be looking to miss. So with that in their minds, the disciples, I'm sure, are thrilled. Here is God. He's doing the very thing, or I should say, here is a man doing the very things that God did. He is anointed by God. He's empowered by God. This is incredible. And so all of that occurs, and then all of a sudden, Jesus tells them, go on to the other side of the lake. Go ahead of me. Go without me. Take the boat and go over. First of all, this doesn't make complete sense. Normally, the rabbi would keep his disciples with him. If he had a message across the lake, he'd send one of his servants. But here Jesus sends the disciples. What must they have thought? What was he doing? Why were they going over there? He's staying back. More perplexing is, he sent them away and he went up to the mountain to pray. Why wouldn't Jesus take them up on the mountain and show them how to pray? And let them observe him as he prayed. But I suspect, as we look at the events begin to unfold, the men did not need to go up with Jesus on the mountaintop to pray, because they are out in the middle of the boat. And they're struggling. The wind is against them. The waves are crashing over the boat. They've been fighting all night. I'm sure they're exhausted by this point. They'd seen the miracle. They'd fed the people. They collected, and immediately they got in the boat. And now all night they've been out fighting against the wind. And it's not that far a boat ride if the wind is not against them. I am certain that their anxieties were up. Beginning, first of all, was, why was Jesus sending us away? And then it turned in, why did Jesus send us out into this storm? Where's God right now? And I'm sure those who were fishermen were very concerned. They knew the kinds of things that could happen in a boat. And those who did not were probably very frightened. And so here they are straining against the wind, praying to God, I'm sure. And all of a sudden, they see something on the water. And you can only imagine what they're thinking. It says it's a ghost. It's a spirit. Maybe it's an omen that we're going to die. And they are filled with fear. And then comes Jesus' comforting words. Don't be afraid. It is I. And then I think a very, very, very bold statement by Peter. We know that Peter is impulsive, but here I think his impulsivity resonates with what Jesus wants. Peter, in his boldness and his impulsiveness, says, Lord, bid me to come out of the water. Let me walk out there with you. And Jesus says, come. And Peter jumps out of the boat. But then he gets his eyes off of Jesus. And he begins to sink. And he cries out, save me! And Jesus comes and he picks him out of the water. And he saves him. And then he turns, and I don't think just to Peter, but to all of them, "O you of little faith, why can't you believe in who I am? Why do you struggle with this?" So with all that said, with that story laid out for you, we have to come back and ask why. What was he doing here? Well, I want to suggest to you that the reason for this miracle, and the reason for some of the other miracles, particularly and finally the miracle of the resurrection, was with the purpose of shaping a community. Remember the story of the potter? Where Jeremiah goes down and he watches the potter who begins to shape the clay, and he cuts some away and he takes it and he smooths it out and he makes it into the design that he wants it to be. In the Old Testament, when God performed all the miracles in Egypt and then in the desert and then later on in the nation of Israel, it was with the purpose of creating a nation of people who would understand, I think, at least two things. And there'd be much more that they would understand. But there are two things that I believe that this miracle was designed to teach. It was to create a community that first of all knew and understood Jesus Christ, that knew the power that he possessed, that recognized his glory. In John chapter 2, there's another one of these miracles that don't completely make sense. Jesus is sitting at a wedding banquet, and the wine is running out. And his mother comes and says, "Can you do something to help?" And Jesus changes the water into wine. You know, again, we understand why he heals the sick, but why that, other than to save the man from some social embarrassment? And it says at the end of the account that this was the first sign Jesus did to show his glory. And glory is not the spectacular that we think of in movies. Glory here is the Shekinah. In the Old Testament, the Shekinah was the symbol of the presence of God, the light that came and said, God is present here. Jesus is revealing his glory, that he is God. And that like God, he can do miracles and work powerfully. And so Jesus is saying to these men, I just fed 5,000 like God did. And now here I am walking in the water. Realize who I am. So that they could become a community that revealed the light and the glory of God. Because they had seen it in Jesus Christ. And then the second point is that from that they would become a people who understood the power that they could possess because of who Jesus was. And I think that's where Peter's boldness, to his everlasting credit, when he jumped out of the boat, he was going to be like Jesus. And that's what Jesus wants, is he wants to form us into a people who are bold and courageous. As Lucy Shaw said, we can live our dull, fearful lives, or we can do the extraordinary things. We can make a difference in the world if we keep our eyes fixed on Jesus. When Peter jumps out in the boat, he's looking at Jesus, he's responding to Jesus, but then all of a sudden, the winds and the waves, the fear comes up, and he sinks. He lost his focus on Jesus. If we want to make a difference in the world, and we can, it takes faith. It takes faith in the God who can work powerfully. And it takes faith that God will work through us. But we have to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, as Hebrews says. Now you're sitting there maybe thinking, yeah, that's nice, Randy, but I can't do spectacular things. I can't do amazing things. Well, I want to take a minute and I want to read a story that was sent to me this week. I was doing some training, and one of the teachers that I was training sent me an account. We were talking about the power of relationships. And it speaks of a teacher as she stood in front of her 5th grade class on the first day of school. She actually told the children an untruth. Like most teachers, she looked at her students and said that she loved them all the same. However, that was impossible because there in the front row, slumped in his seat, was a little boy named Teddy Stoddard. Mrs. Thompson had watched Teddy for the year before and noticed that he did not play with other children, that his clothes were messy, and he constantly needed a bath. In addition, Teddy could be unpleasant. It got to the point where Mrs. Thompson would actually take delight in marking his papers with a broad red pen, marking bold X's and then putting a big F at the top of his papers. At school where Mrs. Thompson taught, she was required to review each child's past records, and she put Teddy's off until last. However, when she reviewed the file, she was surprised. Teddy's 1st grade teacher wrote, "Teddy's a bright child with a ready laugh. He does his work neatly and good manners. He's a joy to be around." His 2nd grade teacher wrote, "Teddy's an excellent student, well liked by his classmates, but he's troubled because his mother has terminal illness and life at home must be a struggle." 3rd grade teacher wrote, "His teacher's death was hard on him. He tries to do his best, but his father doesn't show much interest, and his home life will soon affect him if steps aren't taken." Teddy's 4th grade teacher wrote, "Teddy is withdrawn and doesn't show much interest in school. He doesn't have many friends, and he sometimes sleeps in class." By now, Mrs. Thompson realized the problem, and she was ashamed of herself. She felt even worse when her students brought her a Christmas present wrapped in beautiful ribbons and bright paper, except for Teddy. His present was clumsily wrapped in heavy brown paper that he got from a grocery bag Mrs. Thompson took pains to open in the middle of the other presents. Some of the children started to laugh when she found a rhinestone bracelet with some of the stones missing and a bottle that was 1/4 full of perfume. But she stifled the children's laughter, and she exclaimed how pretty the bracelet was, putting it on and dabbing some of the perfume on her wrist. Teddy Stoddard stayed after school that day just long enough to say, "Mrs. Thompson, you smelled just like Mom used to." She said school that day and cried for an hour. On that very day, she quit teaching, reading, writing, and arithmetic, and she began to teach the children. Mrs. Thompson paid particular attention to Teddy. As she worked with him, his mind seemed to come alive. The more she encouraged him, the faster he responded. By the end of the year, Teddy had become one of the smartest children in the class, and despite her lie that she would love them all as her same children, Teddy had become her teacher's pet. A year later, she found a note under a door from Teddy telling her that she was still the best teacher he ever had in his whole life. 6 years went by before she got another note from Teddy. Then he wrote that he had finished high school 3rd in his class and was still the best teacher he'd ever had in his life. 4 years later, got a letter saying that the whole thing had been tough times. He had stayed in school, stuck with it, and would soon graduate from college with the highest honors. He assured Mrs. Thompson that she was still the best teacher he'd ever had. 4 more years passed, and yet another letter came. This explained he'd gotten his bachelor's degree. He decided to go further. It explained that he was still the best favorite teacher he'd ever had, but now his name was a little longer. The letter was signed Theodore F. Stoddard, M.D. The story doesn't end there, you see. There was yet another letter that spring. Teddy had met a girl and was going to be married. He explained that his father had died a couple of years ago, was wondering if Mrs. Thompson might agree to sit at the wedding in place that was usually reserved for the mother of the groom. And she did. And she wore the bracelet, and one of the rhinestones was still missing. It says they hugged each other. And Dr. Stoddard whispered and said, "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson, for believing me. Thank you for making such a difference in my life." And then the teacher goes on to say how much of a difference he made when he realized what was going on. All it took was building a relationship. And yet, incredible things happened. You can do that. You can be a Mrs. Thompson to somebody. Somebody in a nursing home. A student. Somebody in the neighborhood. We can make a difference. We don't have to do spectacular things in the sense of walking on water. That's not what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying, step out of the boat and do something. At the end of the book, The Crime of Living Cautiously, it says, there are thousands of unnamed, unknown risk takers who form a great cloud of witnesses, who proceed and challenge us. I invite you to add to this list for yourself from Scripture, history, and your own experience. Now will you add your name to this inventory of faith-filled risk takers for God? Are you willing to take God's dare, exposing yourself to the perils at His request? If you want to save your life, you must be willing to lose it. Listen now to the song as we prepare for communion. Come to the